Thank you all for being here. I want to let you know that this is being recorded, and to minimize distractions, we ask that everyone please turn off their camera and also mute themselves. And that will just help us as we go through the presentation. David Williams, my coworker and board member here at the Pacific Northwest Historians Guild, will be moderating this morning's session with Knute Berger. And David will be monitoring the chat for any questions that come up. And after Knute has finished his presentation, then we'll move into those questions. So if you have a thought, jot it down in the chat, and we'll get to that after the end of Knute's presentation. And with that, I am delighted to turn it over to my fellow board member, David Williams. Thank you, David, and Knute, thank you both.
Thank you, Lisa. It is an honor and pleasure to be here speaking to all of you. Today, what I want to do is tell you just a few of the details. I'm sure you've all been in Zoom sessions before, but please, as Lisa said, the mute and the stop video are in the lower, should be in the lower part of your screen, and then the chat session if you have any questions that you want to pose. Before we begin, I'd like to take a moment to acknowledge the Coast Salish peoples of this land, the land which touches the shared water of all tribes and bands within the Duwamish, Puyallup, Suquamish, Tulalip, and Muckleshoot nations. I'm honored and pleased to introduce my friend, Knute Berger. As Knute said earlier, he grew up in Rainier Valley across from Franklin High School and a few blocks from his beloved Six Stadium, in the same neighborhood his father grew up. As he has written, we lived in a neighborhood where lore from personal experience was passed down. Those stories have clearly informed his worldview. As more than most any writer I know, his writing is grounded in the history of Seattle, of Washington, and of the Pacific Northwest. They're stories that aim to find the truth in the past, often truths that people want to overlook, and in some cases dispute. And they are stories that help us better understand ourselves and how knowing our histories can make all of us better citizens now and in the future. Listening to Knute's many places he has worked provides great insight into his passion for local journalism. He was founding editor at East Side Week, executive editor of Washington Magazine, and a longtime editor at Seattle Weekly. He writes a monthly back page column for Seattle Magazine, where he is editor at large. He is a regular news commentator on KUOW-FM and is at present a columnist for Crosscut.com, where he writes about history, as well as provides timely opinion pieces about the region. In 2011, Knute was named Writer-in-Residence at the Space Needle in anticipation of the Century 21 Expo's 50th anniversary, which led to his book, Space Needle, The Spirit of Seattle. His other book is Pugitopolis, a mossback takes on growth addicts, weather wimps, and the myth of Seattle nice. In an interview about the book, he said, "Seattle doesn't need another booster. I had several ideas, one of which was setting up lutefisk stations at the border," which always sounds great. The book exemplifies his writing style of someone who tries and succeeds in getting to the heart of this city without overlooking its faults, foibles, and follies, and yet is still clearly passionate about the city and its many qualities. Perhaps most surprisingly to Knute is that he has now become what I consider to be an influencer, a superstar historian, and even a social media phenomenon through his Mossbacks Northwest series of videos about history in the Pacific Northwest. If you have not seen them, you are missing out. Each is fun and interesting, highlighting Knute's deep commitment to place, to community, to history, and to helping all of us better understand the world around us. Please join me in welcoming Knute Berger to present his keynote address, Nazis, Lynchings, and the Lash Law, Why the Northwest Must Accept and Embrace Its Dark Side. Knute, I turn it over to you.
Well, thank you, David. That's very generous. Thank you, Lisa, and the organizers of the Guild Conference. It's such an honor to be asked to speak. I was going to give this talk a year ago, but the pandemic intervened. I do have something to be happy about today, though, other than giving this talk, and that is I'm getting my second vaccination right after I speak here. So I'm glad that things are moving forward. I thought about changing the topic, throwing it out and starting fresh during the last year. But if anything, I think the last year has convinced me more than ever that our dark side needs to be addressed and discussed. Many people are calling for reckonings, a paying of accounts, reckonings on race, police violence, insurrection, incarceration, Confederate and colonial monuments, disinformation, both sidesism, homelessness, among other things. What drives me is trying to understand the balance sheet, how past behaviors, especially problematic behaviors, have led to now and have been often forgotten or edged to the periphery of the public sphere and memory. Things some historians might know about are not taught in our schools. The reckoning is less about a balance sheet of numbers. It is more like trying to figure out what makes up the cloth of Northwest heritage. I'm not a historian in the professional or academic sense. I'm a writer and lover of history with a deep attachment to the Northwest. My beat at Crosscut and KCTS9 is a self-appointed one to look at the intersection of history, politics, and culture and place. What stories of the past can give us insights into what is happening today? During the past year or more, I've continued to look at that history, especially the history of the far-right politics in the Northwest. I've continued to probe our history of white supremacism. I've dug into the 1930s and how we dealt with or didn't deal with the fascists among us, including the woman pictured here on the left, Lois de Lafayette Washburn, who was indicted for sedition while living in Seattle in 1942. She gave this Nazi salute in front of the federal courthouse in Washington, D.C., not too long before D-Day. She was what today we'd call a right-wing blogger. And it was easy to imagine her at the US Capitol on January 6th, taking selfies as an insurrectionist. The event that delayed this talk, the pandemic, was an opportunity to delve into how we handled the last one a century ago. I've written a dozen stories about how we managed and mismanaged the 1918 pandemic and also Seattle's anti-vaccine movement of the 1920s that followed on its heels. A smallpox outbreak in Seattle schools led a local health official to dub Seattle a hotbed of anti-vaccination activism. I've written about fake news in Washington's populist era, about the supposed kidnapping of a Republican farmer that was blamed on a local paramilitary group in Eastern Washington called the Freeman's Protective Silver Association in the 1890s. It turned out to be a hoax. And I just did a story on how the state came to ban private militias in Washington state's constitution in 1989. It was a response to armed groups being hired by railroads and mine owners. I often rely on the research and scholarship of historians, like many of you, for getting the facts and understanding context. So let me express my deep appreciation to all of you who toil in the realm of history, writing, and research. You and your work are deeply needed in our region now more than ever. And I say now more than ever because in our divided society and in this period of media fracturing and diminishment, in a time of pandemic-related isolation and hardship on health and pocketbooks, the past is a vast resource for perspective, context, and stories that need repeating and uncovering. And I sense there's a hunger for it. The TV history segments I do for KCTS9 have been viewed by over 4 million times on all platforms. We publish a weekly Mossback newsletter that goes to KCTS and Crosscut donors. It is read by some 25,000 people a week. If nothing else, this tells me that there's a public appetite for what we do. The public wants to understand, to hear our region's stories, a desire to connect. They want to be surprised, delighted, and challenged. I want to take you through a few subjects and stories I've worked on in recent years that I think have helped me understand our history better as it relates to some of the front burner issues of our city and region. Urban planners and social justice advocates, all of us really, are trying to deal with the issue of redlining and neighborhood exclusion. Historically, creating segregation, targeting people of color through lending policies, real estate sales, insurance practices, property covenants, and zoning. Seattle was heavily redlined, and the legacy still shows, and in fact has been made worse by gentrification as long-standing communities of color have been pushed out of the city proper. But the Northwest was redlined from the beginning. The genocidal policies toward Native peoples who have lived here since time immemorial was the tragic beginning of a process. From the time of settlement, exclusion of non-whites was on the agenda and brought about by a conscious intention of law. We are not a segregated region by accident. The Oregon Trail could be called the first red line. The early homestead laws were for whites only or biracial people with Native mothers and white fathers. This significantly limited Black people from coming on the Oregon Trail, though some enslaved people did come. It's interesting to note that Peter Burnett, who organized the very first wagon train on the Oregon Trail and became a major political figure in Oregon and California, was a slave owner. Free Blacks were further deterred from coming to the Oregon country by the short-lived but a cruelly conceived Lash law, which banned Blacks from the territory and threatened lashings for those who did not leave until they left. Peter Burnett was the author of that law. While the Lash law itself was relatively short-lived, Oregon passed successive laws that banned Blacks and other people of color from settling in the region. I saw a recent presentation by the head of the Oregon Black Pioneers, who said that while Oregonians voted against allowing slavery, they also voted strongly for Black exclusion. Between 1844 and 1866, he said, Oregon was legally only open to Black settlement in 6 of those 22 years. Poll taxes, limited rights, prohibitions against buying real estate, sundown laws, and outright bans on newcomers were part of a consistent design. And while Blacks, enslaved and free, did live in the region in small numbers, they did so under difficult conditions meant to drive them away or discourage them from coming and staying. The states of Old Oregon, which include Washington, Oregon, Idaho, Western Montana, and just a bit of Wyoming, are still among the whitest states in America. George Bush, a key Black pioneer, came to Puget Sound country specifically to escape the Lash law in Oregon proper and escape the attitudes behind it. The law was unlikely to be forced north of the Columbia and under the eyes of the more racially tolerant Hudson's Bay Company. For one of my TV segments, I had the privilege of showing archaeological artifacts dug up from the old Bush homestead in Tumwater that helped shed light on the Bush family's life there. The family legacy was profound. It included Bush's son, Owen Bush, who became the first Black person elected to the state legislature, where he helped pass the legislation that created what is now Washington State University. Bush's settlement here, after leaving Missouri, a state where slavery was legal, to come to Oregon, then to discover the Lash law awaiting, forced him north into what is now Washington. It was our gain, but imagine how many other dreams went unfulfilled. In the run-up to the Civil War, the Pacific Republic movement proposed that Western states, particularly Oregon, Washington Territory, and California, secede from the Union to form a new country open to slavery, neutral in supporting the South's secession. It was widely debated in the 1850s and revived in the early stages of the Civil War. A Pacific Republic was seen as strategically helpful to the South by providing the Confederacy with a Pacific port. There were also visions by California's pro-Southern legislators pushing for expansion from Alaska to Baja. Many people in the region were Southern sympathizers. Among them, the powerful Joseph Lane, who ran as vice president on the 1860 pro-slavery presidential ticket with John C. Breckinridge, who became a Confederate general. Their campaign manager was Isaac Stevens, Washington Territory's first governor. He became a Union general, but supported the Southern wing of the Democratic Party before the war. It's also interesting, I mean, even in his time, Lane's support of the South during the war made him a pariah in the state of Oregon, but he had played such a founding role in the state as a senator. And you know, there's a county named after him, but there's also a street in Seattle named after him, Lane Street, which runs through the International Chinatown district and the central area. It was named after Joseph Lane. And the problem wasn't all in Oregon. The Washington Territorial Assembly was in sympathy with key decisions that benefited enslavers. Early in 1858, they passed a resolution that affirmed, quote, the opinions and principles, unquote, of the court's infamous Dred Scott decision, which said that no Blacks, free or enslaved, could be citizens, and opened the possibility of extending slavery to the territories. This bill has been mostly ignored in Washington's history. And I just want to say here, and I popped this in here this morning as it was interesting. The fact that the Washington legislature supported the Dred Scott decision is something that's almost unknown. I came across it actually in a footnote in a paper, and I wanted to see the actual proclamation, which you can see part of here. You can see the handwritten proclamation. And so I went to the list that the state maintains of all the territorial legislation. And strangely, the proclamation approving the Dred Scott decision is missing. It's not even on the inventory. Now, I think there may be other territorial bills missing, and it may be a printing error. But I got help from the Washington State Archives tracking down the original document once we found a clue as to what the date of it was. So many thanks to the folks at the Washington State Archives for digging up what I think is an important historical document in the story of race in Washington. A cheerleader for the Union, a cheerleader for the Confederate cause was a San Francisco newspaper editor, publisher, and a Democrat named Beriah Brown, who's shown here on the right. He was extremely anti-Lincoln, a white supremacist, said to be head of the Pacific Coast wing of the pro-Confederate Knights of the Golden Circle, a kind of proto-KKK that tried to subvert Union war efforts outside the South during the war. Brown also participated in an attempt to form an all-white colony in Mexico. When news of Lincoln's assassination arrived, Brown's newspaper, the Daily Democratic Press, was sacked and burned in the streets of San Francisco, and he fled to avoid being lynched. And on the left here is an actual photograph of the crowd that sacked and burned his newspaper, and the state militia is lined up trying to calm things down. He eventually wound up in Oregon and then Washington Territory, where he founded Seattle's first daily newspaper, the Puget Sound Dispatch. By then, he had publicly shed his Copperhead and anti-Reconstruction politics and became a civic booster, a regent at the University of Washington. And he eventually became a mayor of Seattle. Excuse me. His Civil War era politics and history were virtually forgotten and unremarked in his obituaries. Like many in the West, he remade himself and escaped his racist and seditious pedigree. There are many other examples of early American settlers trying to whiten the region. The genocide performed by early militias that massacred Native peoples throughout the region, The anti-Chinese efforts, including the mass expulsions in Seattle and Tacoma, and the Japanese Americans who were incarcerated during World War II. In following up on the Beriah Brown story, I found newspaper accounts of anti-Chinese harassment and terrorism in California under the name of the Ku Klux Klan as early as 1868. And also there were KKK references in Oregon in that same era. So the Klan, as many people believe, didn't come to the Northwest in the 1920s with its resurgence in the North and the West, but it was here on the West Coast at birth. The newspaper clipping on the right is a clipping from a California newspaper talking about the burning of a church in Santa Clara by the Ku Kluxers. And it was a church that was burned because they were conducting Sunday school for Chinese children. It also refers in there to a similar event that happened in Oregon City. An influx of Democrats into Southern and Eastern Oregon during and after the Civil War alarmed Republicans. These were seen largely as Confederate sympathizers or ex-Confederates, sometimes referred to as, quote, the left wing of Price's army, which referred to the Confederate General Sterling Price, who fought for the Confederacy in the West, in Missouri and elsewhere. Price's army swept into control of Oregon's state legislature in 1868 and demanded the resignation of Oregon's two Republican US senators, Henry Corbett and George Henry Williams. Williams later became President Grant's Attorney General and supported US troops in the South and supported Reconstruction and prosecuting the KKK. The Oregonian referred to the Democratic takeover of the legislature as the Ku Klux legislature and worried that the influx of folks from states like Missouri could signal the rebirth of a Knights of the Golden Circle type organization in the new guise of the KKK. The Democrats overturned Oregon's passage of the 14th Amendment, which Beriah Brown, who I mentioned earlier, a former Knight of the Golden Circle and refugee of Southern sympathies, saw as a positive move, quote, favoring white man's government. In 2018, I went to Astoria with Crosscut photographer Matt McKnight to look at their KKK history. The Clatsop County Museum has Klan memorabilia, some of which has been displayed and in its collection. The town was taken over by the Klan in the 1920s, the mayor, the city council, the local sheriff. I got to examine the collection, which consisted of hoods and robes, among other things, left to the museum by local families, mostly anonymously. Most people said they found the garments in trunks or closets, not that Grandpa ever wore them. It was chilling to handle these well-made costumes designed to terrify and intimidate. Someone sewed them. Someone wore them enough to wear the eye holes in the hood that I inspected, which you can see in the picture here. The central photograph is a picture of an enormous, many thousands of people, Klan rally that was held in Astoria in, I think, 1924 at a local baseball field. And that baseball field is the first thing you see when you come into Astoria. It's still used as a ballpark, but this it was a site of a Klan initiation ceremony. And there's a photograph of it here. The Klan was big in Washington too, but to my knowledge, there are no such Klan artifacts in the Museum of History and Industries collection, despite ample photographic evidence at Mohi that the Klan was here. Seattle has history, I think, that is literally still hiding in closets and attics. It should be no surprise that the early 20th century Red Scare, the outlawing of socialism and syndicalism, the emphasis on a new militant nationalism and Americanism followed World War I, and that both should boost the rise of the Klan in the 1920s and see violence such as the 1919 Centralia tragedy that resulted in the death of 4 American legionnaires and a member of the Industrial Workers of the World, whose grave you see here, who was mutilated and lynched from a local bridge. The picture at the bottom is a group of National Guardsmen guarding his, what it was at the time, his secret burial. I think that World War I, no, I had a chance to see an old Seattle Police Department mug book of mug shots from the era. And under each mug shot was a list of the crimes of the picture, under the pictures of the men that were wanted. Murder, robbery, etc. Under one, it simply said IWW. I think that World War I and the pandemic, which lingered beyond 1919, played a role in the social tumult that followed in the 1920s, from the KKK to the Jazz Age excess. I suspect we're in for quite a ride in the months ahead. As the Klan began to fade here, some of its members were attracted to the Silver Legion. The Silver Legion was the invention of a former journalist and screenwriter named William Dudley Pelley. And it was one of many groups that popped up. In the era of Sinclair Lewis's It Can't Happen Here, there were people trying to make a Nazi-inspired America happen here. Pelley viewed himself as the American Hitler, virulently anti-Semitic. He proposed putting Jews on reservations called Beth Havens, and he formed a legion based on Germany's brown shirts and Italy's black shirts. His ideology was a mixture of hate and a form of Christianity with himself at the center, communing on the astral plane with Jesus. He also believed the Great Pyramid of Egypt had encoded plans for the future. He envisioned an all-white America ruled by himself. It sounds nutty, but he had tens of thousands of followers, and they worked with the pro-Nazi German-American Bund and other organizations to foment a revolution to overthrow the president they called Franklin Delano Roosevelt. Pelley attempted to rewrite history with the mass distribution of the Protocols of the Elders of Zion, and by circulating newspapers and pamphlets falsely attributing anti-Semitic attitudes to Benjamin Franklin and George Washington. As with the Bund, he sold fascism as an all-American apple pie ideology. His local followers, headquartered in Chehalis, were doctors, lawyers, businessmen, teachers, and at least one beauty queen. They were middle-class folk, and many of them had one thing in common. Many were descended from local settlers. In 1936, Pelley ran for president. And since Washington State was the only state where he could get on the ballot, he moved his headquarters to Seattle and ran at the top of a full slate of so-called Christian Party candidates. Supporters in Redmond built him a log cabin style lodge, the Silver Lodge, which is where he and his supporters gathered. And there's a picture on the left here of the lodge in its final years. It was standing well into the 1980s, and I think perhaps even into the early 90s in Redmond, not far from downtown Redmond on what was a local farm. Here's a picture of the Silver Lodge in its day. The photographs of the lodge, astoundingly, there are photographs that exist that were taken by fellow silver shirts, and they've made their way into the University of Washington Special Collection in the last few years. I find this shot particularly chilling. It's not just men in their silver shirts, but multi-generations of friends and families out in front of what the local Jewish transcript newspaper called the Temple of Hate. I talked to a man who taught high school history in Redmond back in the 1960s. And the relic of this lodge was well known to his students, although they didn't know the story behind it, but the term that they called it was the Nazi church, which is actually a pretty fair description. And I just think this picture is fascinating because people have tried to portray the silver shirts, and they were a fringe movement. They had tens of thousands of followers nationwide. When Pelly ran for president in 1936, he only received, I don't know, about 1,600 votes, which was about the same, slightly less than the Communist Party candidate. So it wasn't like he was a major force in the politics of realism, but in terms of the politics of the far right in this country, he was a very significant figure. Pelly was defeated, obviously. He was later jailed for sedition during World War II. If Pelly was a kind of domestic pretend Nazi, we did have real ones in the region, staffing Seattle's consulate, visiting local members of the German community, some of whom happily worked for the Third Reich. Seattle consuls like Walter Reinhardt and Gustav Reichel arranged to fly the swastika flag from the consulate and encouraged local politicians like the mayors of Seattle and Portland to salute them with an upraised arm at annual German Day events. Mayor John Doerr is known to have given the Nazi salute at one of these events. Reinhardt, by the way, was later expelled from England for espionage. Among Nazis who came here to propagandize or scout local attitudes were on the right here, Fritz Wiedemann, the head German consul in San Francisco, made frequent visits to Seattle. He was Hitler's former adjutant and head of German spy operations on the West Coast. It's known now that the defenses for Pearl Harbor before the attack passed through Wiedemann's hands to superiors in New York. Another visitor was Herman Melhorn, man in the lower left corner there. He was an officer in the Gestapo and the SS when he visited Seattle under the guise of a tourist, although the people he were visiting knew that he was a member of the Gestapo. He was wined and dined by local members of the German-American business community and at local clubs like the Seattle Tennis Club and local restaurants. Melhorn was on an intelligence gathering mission during his visit to the Northwest. He later played a big role in implementing the final solution in Poland, including the very first use of mobile gas units for mass extermination. And there were other sympathizers such as Hermann Schwinn, head of the Bund on the West Coast, who traveled to the Northwest to show the Nazi flag and lead local Germans in singing the SS anthem, the Horst Wessel song, at a rally on First Hill. He's in the upper left, seated with the mustache. He was arrested, interned, and deported. And there were others, sympathizers. There was Elwood Towner, who went by the name of Chief Red Cloud, a Nazi sympathizer who lectured on how Native American traditions melded with Nazi values. And you can just see, if you look at in the lower left corner of his picture, he's wearing the headdress. You can just make out that he wore a beaded swastika armband. He apparently had been radicalized against the Roosevelt administration's treatment of Native Americans and the construction of the Columbia River dams, which have been so devastating to salmon and native sites. Towner traveled the US, giving talks, and was a regular at the Portland Bund meetings and an admirer of Pelly, who he had met in Portland. One of Hitler's biggest local fans was the noted skier and attorney Hans Otto Giese, who worked for the German consulate and made pro-Hitler speeches right up to the war. The government temporarily banned him from the West Coast and tried to take his citizenship away. He was a naturalized German, but failed. Seattle quickly forgot his pre-war enthusiasm for the Third Reich. World War II silenced many of these people, but Pelly's legacy is that some of his followers were instrumental in forming post-war groups like the John Birch Society, the Posse Comitatus, and Aryan Nations. Pelly gave up his far-right advocacy for New Age religion after prison, but many others did not. And their themes echo from state capitals to the US Capitol. They contended that authoritarianism and fascism and white supremacism and anti-Semitism was all American, or ultra-Americanism, they called it, in the spirit of 1776, the Revolution, freedom and liberty, and Christianity. This was the message of hundreds of far-right groups in the pre-World War II era, just as it is today. Looking at the past this way is not about dredging up negative stuff. There are times when I worry about history repeating itself, be it the politics of the 1850s and 1860s, the era from World War I to World War II, or in the politics of the first 2 decades of the 21st century. One discouraging thing is how sometimes the repetition of bad behaviors is so exact. In the coverage of the 1918 pandemic, the era was rife with conspiracy theories, false cures, anti-mask and anti-vaccine activism, hostility just to the idea of public health. They say those who don't know history are doomed to repeat it. I tend to think that even knowing it will repeat it anyway. On this slide, there's this picture of a man being declined on the trolley because he's not wearing a mask, but there are also some clippings here of anti-mask behavior in Yakima and Walla Walla. People who refused to wear masks in a public setting were in some cases arrested, and in other cases, the public health authorities, say, such as in Walla Walla, refused state mask mandates. History tells us we can make progress anyway. Police reform, defunding the police, the abolition and incarceration are current issues being discussed and debated, considered in the hope of improving law enforcement and the justice system. Voices for change have often helped improve things. It was women getting the vote that helped Seattle advance the cleanup of City Hall and begin to create the social safety net here. Advocacy by Seattle socialists and women led to the city's ending its use of chain gangs and helped to get rid of the dungeon where prisoners were brutally treated, called the Black Hole, that was underneath the building shown here on the right called Katzenjammer Castle, which was Seattle's post-fire police station and City Hall, which is a fitting symbol for how all of these things are tied together in one large rambling structure. This last slide shows some suffragists putting up signs in 1911. Women got the vote and they used it to recall Seattle's corrupt mayor, Hiram Gill, and replace him with George Dilling, who's shown there on the right. Progress isn't always steady. Dilling wasn't mayor for long, replaced by another progressive who was replaced by members of the business community or people trying to reinstate the corrupt political system, which lasted on and on in various forms until certainly the 1970s. Still, despite efforts at exclusion, the Northwest is increasingly diverse. We're working on getting to the next level of breaking down racial barriers and seeking greater equity. The Axis lost World War II despite Belly and the Bund and Hitler's helpers. We now recognize the wrongs of the mass incarceration of Japanese Americans during the war, and that recognition only deepens with continued documentation. Our lawmakers got past the Dred Scott and the Lash law, and we've been more welcoming to immigrants and newcomers. We've resisted federal actions that have abused immigrants and refugees, but there is a long way to go locally and nationally. By reminding ourselves of past sins, we have measurements by which we can and must judge what we're doing today. What is replicating the mistakes of the past, how we have overcome other wrongs. We can weigh together remedies for conciliation and reconciliation. We can see where we've improved and what still holds us in its grip. We can learn to see and appreciate our own complexity, which is not always easy when we are in the midst of our own personal issues, lives, and dynamics. Or when there are huge holes left in the history we are taught. I said in my talk's title that we should embrace our dark side, and I don't mean that as an invitation to celebrate it, but I do mean embrace it very much as part of who we were, who we are, where we're from, and the trajectories that we're on. I mean it in the sense that if we care about systemic problems, we need to understand their scope, their origins, their role in creating the realities that we're born into. We're living in a time of reevaluation. We're questioning old heroes and looking for new ones. We're taking down monuments and thinking about new commemorations. We're looking to better ourselves through greater understanding in order to resist the impulse to find comfort through ignorance. This is hard, but I believe that it is good for us. So thank you very much for asking me to speak today.
Well, thank you, Knute, for an amazing talk, and as you usually do, providing not only insight, but also just history that many of us did not know and did not appreciate, the depth and the challenges and the conflicts that have been a part and still are part of the story of the Pacific Northwest. I'm happy to open this up to questions if you want to type them into the chat. That's one option. Another option is to unmute yourself and speak. And I guess I would just, if I may, take the privilege of being the moderator and ask Knute a question. Much of this focuses on the history, and yet we saw, if those of you who get the Seattle Times saw David Horsey's column today, the cartoon, excuse me, where he shows the Nazis coming out of hibernation and in the Northwest, and it's certainly still part of our story. Is there connective tissue, lessons, observations? Knute?
Yeah, that's a great question. It was a funny cartoon. In a way, I wish it were true that there had been a hibernation period. I guess it's all in perspective and depends on what kinds of units of time you're looking at. One of the reasons I got interested in local history, when I was at East Side Week as editor, we did a lot of history trying to illuminate the history of the East Side. We ran a cover story about this massive Ku Klux Klan rally that was held in Issaquah in the fields there by what's now Gilman Village. And it was also at a time when Aryan Nations was in the news. This is the early 90s, and somebody wrote in and asked me a question, and that was like, the Pacific Northwest is such a nice place. It's so beautiful. How can there be Nazis here? And I decided to, I thought about that question because here was somebody who thought this ran completely counter to our image. And in some ways it does, but the image is pretty questionable. And you can actually find interesting threads when the state of Idaho was carved out of the Washington Territory. It was done in part to keep essentially a Southern Democratic population from de-Republicanizing Western Washington during the Civil War. It was actually partly a war measure. There was a surge in the 1860s into Idaho, as there was in Southern Oregon, of people with strong Confederate sympathies who brought a lot of their ideology with them. And that was caused by, the silver fields in Idaho. And so if you kind of go back and you look at these immigration and population trends, you find some consistency that suggests that it's not at all a surprise that there would be a strong Klan here, that you would find people with Aryan nation sympathies here. And of course, even when Aryan nations rolled up and went away and sold off their property and disappeared, they had attracted many other people who see the Pacific Northwest, particularly Eastern Washington, Northern Idaho, and Western Montana, as what they call the last redoubt. this is the last bastion for an all-white nation. And that underlies some of the rumblings of secession and other things. So the cartoon of David Horsey suggesting the Nazis have been in hibernation, they've been around, and consistency, I guess it's just a matter of how vocal they've been over the years and when.
Right. Great, thank you. Dan, you have you have a hand up. Do you have a question?
Yes, hi, thanks. Knute, that's really wonderful to have all this laid out for us. There's another aspect, I guess, to our dark side that has long been of concern to me, and I'm wondering whether you just consider this to be a whole different area, a digression, or somehow related. And that's the fact that if we look at our current, the wealth of our region, the success in the international stage, the fact that our economic prowess to a great degree derives on the military engineering technology that was used not only in the greatest mass destruction of world culture, but also, of course, the use of weapons of mass destruction against hundreds of thousands of civilians. How do we work this into our acknowledgement of our dark side, recognize the fact that we have tremendous wealth in our area that's really based on on all this destruction, and how do we turn that wealth back to making some kind of amends, or even acknowledging the fact that it's gotten us to where we are today?
Yeah, I mean, there are activists working on those projects for amends and reconciliation with Nagasaki, and in those direct terms, there's some very good books on Hanford history that have come out recently. There's another one coming out from WSU Press that looks at the impact on people of color in the Hanford and Tri-Cities area from projects out there. So, that's something I think people are really, just now really digging into in terms of what those global ramifications are. We tend to take a lot of the military industrial complex stuff for granted. I don't know where it ranks now, but I remember when I was at the Weekly, we did a number of articles about it, and simply it was, I think, of all economic sectors, it was the third largest in the Puget Sound region was military and defense work. And that's something that just isn't on anybody's radar screen, although now you see some tech workers, people at Microsoft resisting military contracts or wanting to ensure that their software is not used for those purposes. I think we can't look at that stuff enough yet. I mean, I think I think you're right. I mean, I just think there's still a lot to be examined there. And then, of course, there is the larger issue of the economic disparities and how resources can be shared or distributed or produced in a more equitable way. That's kind of a whole larger question. We've actually sort of led on the left of that in terms of being, the old, 47 states in the Soviet of Washington. We have a very strong progressive and labor history as well, which is in many ways much better documented than the history I've been poking into on the far right. And those, those struggles for justice are something that is also very much a part of who we are. And yeah, but I think you're right. It usually takes a war or some event like that to sort of bring to the surface our role in those international business and military dynamics.
So Knute, there is a question in the chat from what was the outcome of the Silver Shirt members during World War II?
So it's quite interesting. So Pelly was convicted of sedition, and he had also committed fraud and how he ran his organization and whatnot. So he spent the war in prison, didn't get out till the 1950s. Many of the other silver shirts were simply banned from the coasts or any place that was deemed defense sensitive areas. And so the silver shirts, for the most part, sort of dropped below the radar, but some of them founded new groups. So, I mentioned at the beginning this woman, Lois de Lafayette Washburn. She wasn't the only local person who was arrested and tried for sedition. There was a man named Frank Clark who lived in Tacoma, who was a former silver shirt. He'd had a falling out with Pelly, and he founded a couple of organizations. One was called the Freemen of America, I think. Another one was I'm trying to remember the name, but the Gentile Defense, or the Gentile Protective Association. He was a real militant. There's a book called Undercover, which was written by an investigative writer under the name of John Roy Carlson. He infiltrated a whole bunch of right-wing groups before the war and during the war. He wrote a couple of books about it. It's really amazing stuff. And you can see that at Lois de Lafayette and Frank Clark's trial, there were 44 people, 30 people charged with sedition who were in a mass trial, and the trial turned into a complete farce. So essentially, during the war, many of them just went underground for a while and then reemerged both during and after the war in a whole kind of panoply of right-wing organizations, which then gained strength during the McCarthy era, and then again, sort of during the Goldwater era.
Okay, thank you. There's also a question that's sort of answered in the chat. Were there many lynchings in the Pacific Northwest?
Yeah, it depends on how you define it, which, I mean, I don't, there's a guy who used to teach at Evergreen who he's at another university now, and I can't remember which one, but he's written several books on the history of lynching in America, which are really enlightening. And in one of those books, he ran down as many accounts of lynching in Washington as he could find. His lynching was essentially devoted to sort of private citizens interrupting the justice process to and most of the people lynched were white or Native American. And often for things like murder or now there were some political lynchings. As I mentioned, Wesley Everest in Centralia was lynched. There was an Italian prisoner of war who was supposedly lynched at Fort Lawton, although there's questions about that case. But I think the legal lynching was the worst, and this was the U.S. Army using hanging against Native American chiefs or Native Americans who were turned over to them in the process of threats from the military to punish people who had attacked settlements or were perceived as enemies. Chief Leshai's hanging is effectively a lynching, and I attended the retrial there that was done back in I guess that was the early 2000s in Tacoma, which looked at that case because Leshai was hung, but he was, if you believe the worst about Leshai, he really should have been treated as a prisoner of war. And so there was a mass lynching in the wake of the Battle of Cascade Blockhouse in the 1850s. There were lynchings of Native Americans after the Whitman massacre. So I think if you look at that, you know, it's been a very, we have a very sordid history, and it just depends on where you're drawing the lines.
Okay. And there's a quite couple questions sort of about what about the Proud Boys in the Pacific Northwest?
Well, when I read about the Proud Boys, and there's this, I mean, I think they're from all over the state, but there's a kind of nexus that's been in the Vancouver, you know, Clark County area, and they tend to show up in Portland confronting Antifa and whatnot. You know, when I heard about you know, these Proud Boy, you know, essentially racist paramilitary group in Southwest Washington, I mean, there's a case of, you know, Southwest Washington was, there was a lot of political violence there, of course, in the era of the Wobblies and unions. There was anti-Chinese violence there. The Silver Shirts headquarters in Washington State was in Chehalis, Centralia, which is, of course, where the Everett Massacre was. And there were some things written at the time where people said, well, it's no wonder the Silver Shirts are here, pointing back to the Everett Massacre, I mean, the Centralia Massacre, so-called. And so one thing I think is that political culture in certain parts of the state get really entrenched, and they don't change much over time. And that's true in liberal areas. It's true in conservative areas. And you get these sort of micro habitats of certain kinds of political, you know, or ideological commitment, and people aren't even conscious of it. And it just continues to kind of erupt according to historical patterns you can find.
Interesting. So there's one, we've got just a couple minutes. Knute,
Okay.
There's one sort of question of someone new to this dark history of the PNW. Where do you recommend they start? Are there articles, pamphlets, books, and if it doesn't work now to tell us, and you wanted to let us know later, we could certainly, when we send out our follow-up to participants, we can certainly include that. Might be an interesting thing if you want to do it that way.
I mean,
or if
just
things leap out immediately.
Yeah, I'm happy to provide some links, both to some things that I've written, but things that other people have written. There are people who, I think in the state of Oregon, there's a lot of historians are working on issues about the truth of slavery in Oregon, about the exclusion laws. The Oregon Encyclopedia, which you can just find online, has a lot of great stuff. If you're looking at Black history, blackpast.org is a tremendous resource about Northwest history. And there are a lot of good books about the Ku Klux Klan, for example, of the 1920s. There's I'm trying to think of the name of one that is written by a scholar who comes from Oregon, but looks at the 1920s Klan and what that was all about. That's a really good book. So there's a lot of good material on these different topics. There's no compendium of, you know, horrible history. Maybe we should make one. Yeah,
sadly. So on that note, I would like to thank Knute for, once again, as I said earlier, just a thoughtful and, as usual, great talk to help us understand the world that we live in. I think at this point, I'm going to turn it back to my esteemed colleague and amazing organizer of this event. I'd also like to thank, as a fellow board member, and acknowledge very much publicly the incredible work that Lisa has done in pulling this together. She was kind enough to thank the rest of the board, and we did what we could, but really, I would like to at least give a hand to Lisa for her amazing work. So thank you, Lisa.
Very much. Thank you, Knute. That was so fascinating. And I still have chills really about all that's happened in the past year, and to be able to kind of consider the roots and how deep they are in terms of why we're experiencing some of the pain that we're experiencing right now. invite everyone to take a quick break, and we will stay right here at this link and convene in about 15 minutes or so for our presentation, our panel presentation about the military and post-World War II politics. And Knute, I hope that you're symptom-free with your second shot, and that it's a mere pinprick, and that you can go on about your life. And we'll all be ready to do the same soon.
Yeah, thank you very much, Lisa. And again, thanks to everybody who attended the talk. It's really an honor to be here. So take care. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.